How to stay unshaken when people test you. There is a specific type of person who is very difficult to deal with. Not because they are loudest, not because they are most forceful, not because they have more resources, more authority, or more obvious power. They are difficult to deal with because they are genuinely unmoved. When you push them, something happens, and it is not what the push was designed to produce. When you challenge them, they do not defend. When you provoke them, the provocation loses its energy in the absence of the reaction that would complete its circuit. When you test them, the test reveals nothing useful about how to control them, because their behavior is governed by something internal rather than by whatever the external stimulus is trying to produce. This quality, the specific unshakability of the person whose internal state is not accessible to social manipulation, is among the most powerful and most consistently misunderstood forms of psychological strength available. It is not coldness. It is not arrogance. It is not the performance of indifference or the cultivation of a protective emotional distance. It is the genuine capacity to remain composed when composition is being tested, to think and choose from a stable internal foundation regardless of what the external environment is producing. Most people are not this. Most people are significantly more available to social influence, to emotional manipulation, and to the testing behaviors that others use consciously or automatically to assess and establish where the levers are. The availability is not a moral failing. It is the default condition of a social and emotional system that was shaped by environments in which the responses of others to your behavior were among the most important inputs you had to navigate. The system learned to monitor those responses, to anticipate them, to adjust behavior in their direction. This monitoring produced social adaptation. It also produced vulnerability, the susceptibility to having the monitoring used against you, to having the anticipated disapproval or the expected reaction used as leverage to produce behavior that serves someone else's purposes rather than your own. This audiobook is the specific training for this specific vulnerability, not training to become cold or socially disengaged, training to become genuinely less available to being moved by what people do to try to move you while remaining fully available to genuine connection, genuine engagement, and genuine relationship. The person who cannot be shaken is not the person who cannot feel. They are the person whose feeling no longer automatically produces the behavioral output that social manipulation requires. 10 chapters, each layer a deeper development of the unshakable quality. By the end, you will understand why people test, what they are looking for, how they use what they find, and most importantly, how to stop being what they find it in. Introduction. What it means to be unshaken. To be unshaken is not to be unmoved. The distinction is foundational and worth holding clearly before anything else in this audiobook is built. The unmoved person has achieved a kind of emotional closure, a sealed-off condition in which incoming social stimuli do not produce emotional response. This is not what is being built here. It is not achievable by most people, not genuinely desirable, and importantly, not what actually constitutes psychological strength in social environments. The person who feels nothing in response to social events cannot read those events accurately, cannot build genuine relationships, and cannot navigate the full complexity of what social environments require. The unshaken person is moved, feels the provocation, registers the manipulation attempt, notices the test, experiences the social pressure, What is different is the relationship between being moved and what happens next. For the unshaken person, being moved does not automatically produce the behavioral output that the social event was designed to produce. The feeling arrives, the assessment occurs, the response is chosen. The circuit between the incoming social stimulus and the behavioral response runs through genuine deliberation rather than through automatic reactive execution. This is the specific capacity that this audiobook builds layer by layer, chapter by chapter, from the foundational understanding of why people test and provoke and manipulate, through the specific practices of emotional regulation and strategic response, to the integrated quality of psychological composure that is the genuine unshakability the title names. The building begins with the most fundamental question: why do people test you in the first place? Chapter 1. Why people test you. People test you to find out how easily you can be managed. This is a statement that requires careful hearing. It is not a claim that the people around you are primarily engaged in the deliberate, calculated project of controlling you. Most testing behavior is not that conscious or that strategic. It is the automatic expression of the social intelligence system, the continuous, largely automatic assessment that every person is conducting of the other people in their environment: who is reliable, who is a threat, who can be influenced, where the boundaries are, what the consequences of various behaviors will be. This assessment is ongoing. It does not require the tester to be consciously aware they are conducting it. The behavior that tests you is often the natural expression of the tester's own patterns, their habitual ways of engaging with people that happen to function as tests because they reveal the tested person's responses in ways that inform the assessment. The sharp comment that provokes a defensive reaction. The small boundary violation that establishes whether the boundary will be enforced. The minor challenge to your stated position that reveals whether you will hold it under minimal pressure. None of these may have been strategically planned. All of them function as tests. The results of these tests are registered and used, even when neither party explicitly acknowledges this. The person who observes that you become defensive when your competence is questioned has learned something about you that will shape how they engage with you in the future. The person who discovers that a boundary violation produces no consequence has learned that the boundary is not enforced, which alters their model of what is possible in the relationship. The person who finds that a minor challenge produces capitulation has learned that minimal pressure produces compliance. Social dominance tests are the most explicitly interpersonal form of this continuous assessment, the specific behaviors through which social hierarchies are established and maintained in ordinary human interaction. Social hierarchy is present in every group of humans, regardless of the explicit values of the group or the stated commitments to equality of its members. The hierarchy may not be formalized, may not be acknowledged, may not be structured around conventional status markers like title or seniority, but it is present in the functional reality of whose opinions carry more weight, whose preferences organize group decisions, who is deferred to and who defers, who initiates and who follows. These functional hierarchies are established and maintained through the continuous low-level testing and response cycle that constitutes ordinary social interaction. The social dominance test is a behavioral input that probes where you place yourself in the hierarchy relative to the tester, and that generates information about this based on your response. The interruption in conversation that tests whether you will allow it or assert your right to continue. The dismissal of a contribution in a meeting that tests whether you will let the dismissal stand or maintain the position. A slightly more demanding request than the relationship seems to warrant. Testing whether the relationship asymmetry that the demand implies will be accepted. The responses to these tests, whether deliberate or automatic, communicate your position in the hierarchy. The person who accepts the interruption communicates something. The person who calmly continues communicates something different. The person who defensively escalates communicates something different from both. The test is not just about what the specific behavior was. It is about the pattern of internal governance that the behavior reveals. Hidden power dynamics are the structural context within which the tests occur, the ongoing negotiation of relative standing and influence that underlies most social interaction, including interactions that appear to be primarily about their stated content. Most conversations, meetings, and relationships are operating simultaneously at two levels: the surface level of the stated content and the relational level of the ongoing negotiation of who has what standing, whose frame is organizing the interaction, whose preferences are shaping the outcome. The surface level is visible and explicit. The relational level is largely implicit and often entirely invisible to participants who are attending only to the surface. The person who attends only to the surface level is playing one game, while the relational level plays a different and more determinative one underneath it. The meeting that appears to be about the project proposal is also a negotiation of whose expertise is being recognized, whose judgment is being deferred to, who is in the role of evaluating and who is in the role of being evaluated. The relationship that appears to be a friendship is also a continuous calibration of who is more invested, who is more available, who adjusts their behavior more in response to the other's preferences. Awareness of these hidden dynamics does not require cynicism. It requires the specific perceptual capacity to notice the relational layer operating alongside the content layer, to see the test within the ordinary exchange, the power negotiation within the collaboration, the dominance probe within the friendly conversation. Without this awareness, the responses you are providing to these invisible tests are being determined by your reactive patterns rather than by your considered judgment about how you want to position yourself. Why reactions reveal weakness is the specific mechanism that makes the testing behavior so consistently and reliably informative for the tester. A reaction, in the sense used throughout this audiobook, the automatic, emotionally driven behavioral output that precedes deliberate choice, is informative not primarily because of its content, but because of what it reveals about the regulatory architecture behind it. A defensive reaction to a minor challenge reveals that the challenge was experienced as threatening to the self-inept, which tells the tester that the self-inept is fragile enough to be threatened by minor challenges, which is useful information about where the lever is. An angry reaction to a boundary violation reveals that the boundary is emotionally invested in to a degree that makes its enforcement potentially emotionally costly, which tells the tester that the boundary can be probed further, because the emotional investment is a source of vulnerability as well as a source of resistance. The person who reacts, who provides the automatic, emotionally driven output that the test was designed to elicit, is providing a comprehensive map of their internal landscape to anyone who has the attention to read it. The triggers, the sensitivities, the self-dependencies, the emotional investments, all of these are legible in the pattern of reactions that the reactive person displays across many testing interactions. The unshaken person provides this map much more sparingly because the responses they provide are chosen rather than automatic. They reflect deliberate decisions about what to communicate rather than the direct expression of the internal landscape. This is not dishonesty. It is the appropriate governance of what information about your internal state is made available to others through your behavior. The deliberate response communicates what you choose to communicate. The reactive response communicates everything the activation state is producing, regardless of whether you would choose to communicate it. Chapter 2. The Psychology of Provocation. Provocation only works when you react. The reaction is the point. This statement is the most important single insight in this chapter, and understanding it changes the relationship to provocation at a fundamental level. The provocation is not primarily the hostile comment, the unfair criticism, the contemptuous gesture, the deliberate boundary violation. These are the delivery mechanisms. The provocation is the reaction they are designed to produce. And the reaction is what the provoker actually wants, because the reaction serves a function that the provocation itself cannot serve alone. What function the reaction serves depends on the specific dynamic in which the provocation occurs. In some cases, the reaction provides the emotional satisfaction of the provoker's superiority. The triggered person's loss of composure confirms the provoker's implied position that the triggered person can be moved. In some cases, the reaction provides information. The specific nature of the defensive, angry, or anxious response tells the provoker exactly where the sensitivity is, which allows subsequent interactions to be directed more precisely at the vulnerability. In some cases, the reaction provides social cover. The escalating behavior of the triggered person becomes the story that others see, obscuring the initial provocation that produced it. In all cases, the reaction completes the provocation. Without it, the provocation is incomplete. The contemptuous comment that received no reaction is not a successful provocation, it is a failed one. A bid for dominance that found no response and therefore established nothing. The provoker who receives no reaction must either escalate, which typically reveals more about their own needs and instability than about the unresponsive person, or withdraw. Why people provoke others is a question that has several distinct answers depending on the type of provocation and the context in which it occurs. And understanding the range of motivations makes the behavior more legible and therefore less powerful. Status anxiety is among the most common drivers of provocative behavior. The person who is experiencing uncertainty about their own standing, competence, or value in a social environment will sometimes attempt to resolve that anxiety by diminishing others, not through direct confrontation, which carries risk, but through the specific forms of provocation that are deniable, the slight that can be explained as a joke, the criticism embedded in apparent praise, the display of expertise that implicitly diminishes the expertise of others in the room. These provocations are not primarily about the target. They are about the provoker's own need to establish and maintain a sense of relative standing. Control seeking is another common driver, the attempt to establish or reassert influence over another person's behavior through the demonstration that certain behaviors produce specific reactions on demand. This is the provoker who has discovered, through past interactions, that a specific type of input reliably produces a specific emotional output from you, and who uses this knowledge to produce the output when it serves them to get you defensive when they need to redirect attention from their own behavior, to get you angry when they need to escalate a conflict, to get you anxious when they need compliance. A third driver, less deliberate than either of these, is simply the automatic expression of the provoker's own activated emotional state. The person who is frustrated provokes in the direction of their frustration. The person who is experiencing humiliation provokes in the direction that displaces the humiliation. This is not strategic in any deliberate sense. It is the behavioral expression of an internal state that is looking for relief through the activation of a corresponding state in someone else. Emotional traps are the specific interaction designs that provocation creates, the conversational or social structures that, once entered, tend to produce the reactive behavioral outputs that the provocation was designed to elicit, and that tend to worsen the position of the person who enters them. The emotional trap functions by creating a social context in which the reactive response is the defensive reply. The escalating counter, the emotional expression appear not just natural but necessary. The trap has established the social expectation that a person in this situation should respond in these ways, and the failure to respond in the expected way feels, from inside the trap, like a concession of some kind. Consider the specific trap of the public challenge. Someone challenges your position, your competence, or your standing in front of others. The social context creates the expectation that you must defend yourself, that silence or calm non-engagement would be read as an admission of the implicit accusation. The defensive or aggressive response the context appears to require is precisely the response that most effectively escalates the situation, reveals the vulnerability, and provides the provoker with the demonstration of your triggered state that was the actual goal. The trap is effective because it disguises the choice available to you. It presents the reactive response as the only socially acceptable option, while the calm non-greetive response feels like surrender. Understanding that this presentation is the trap, that the calm response is not surrender but is in fact the response that most effectively denies the provoker what they were seeking, is the cognitive key to escaping the design of the trap rather than being caught in it. Recognizing psychological games is the perceptual skill that makes this understanding operational, the capacity to see the trap before entering it, or to identify the game that is being played while it is being played rather than only in retrospect. Psychological games in ordinary social interaction are recognizable by their specific structural features. They involve an implicit social script that specifies expected roles and responses. They involve a design in which one party benefits from the other's compliance with the script. And they involve the concealment of the game's design within a surface presentation that makes participation in the script appear natural, appropriate, or even required. The recognition practice asks, when you notice a reactive pull in an interaction, what is the script here? What am I expected to do in response to this? And who benefits from my doing it? The question does not require paranoia or the assumption that all social interaction is strategic games. It requires the brief assessment of whether the interaction is producing an automatic pull toward a specific behavioral output that would serve someone else's purposes, and whether that pull is being produced by genuine considerations or by the structure of the provocation. When the recognition is available, when the game has been identified while it is still being played, the choice of whether to play it becomes real. The unshaken person does not automatically exit every game or refuse every reactive pull. They see the game clearly, assess whether the reactive response or the calm non-response better serves their genuine purposes, and act accordingly. The choice is what makes the behavior strength rather than simply a different form of automaticity. Chapter 3. Remaining calm in conflict. The most powerful person in any conflict is the one who is still thinking. Conflict is the specific social environment in which the reactive default is most powerfully reinforced, where the emotional activation is highest. The social expectation of reciprocal intensity is strongest, and the consequences of poor reactive responses are most immediately visible and most difficult to walk back. It is also, precisely because of this intensity, the environment in which the composure of the unshaken person produces its most visible and most significant advantage. The person who is thinking in a conflict, who has maintained access to their deliberate processing while everyone else has moved into the fast, reactive, emotionally governed mode, is operating from a cognitive quality that is genuinely different from and superior to the activated mode. They see the full situation more accurately. They see more of the available options. They can model the consequences of each option further into the future, and they can choose a response that serves their genuine purposes rather than one that satisfies the immediate pressure for emotional discharge. Emotional discipline during arguments is the specific application of the broader emotional regulation capacity to the compressed, high-intensity conditions of active conflict. The conflict environment creates specific challenges for the emotional discipline practice. The physiological activation of the stress response is typically at or near its maximum, which means the regulatory resources available for the deliberate pause are being taxed most heavily at exactly the moment they are most needed. The social pressure of the conflict, the reciprocal intensity expectation, the social script that specifies matching the emotional temperature of the exchange, is pushing toward reactive execution rather than deliberate assessment. And the cognitive distortions of the activated state are most severe, meaning the perception of the situation that the regulatory effort is working to maintain is being most powerfully distorted by the state it is trying to regulate. These challenges explain why conflict is the hardest environment in which to apply emotional discipline, and why the early-stage practice of the pause should begin in the easier environments and build capacity before the conflict situations are taken on. The capacity to hold composure in the intense conditions of genuine conflict is built through the accumulated practice of holding it in the milder conditions of ordinary daily testing, the slightly provocative comment, the minor challenge, the small social pressure. These smaller practices build the regulatory infrastructure that can hold under the greater demand of genuine conflict. The specific practice of emotional discipline in conflict has three primary elements. The first is the physiological intervention, the deliberate slowing of breath and the reduction of vocal volume and pace when the activation is rising. This is not the performance of calm for the benefit of the other party. It is the genuine management of the physiological state, the engagement of the parasympathetic system to counteract the sympathetic activation that the conflict is producing. The effects are real and measurable. The heart rate reduces slightly. The cortisol level begins to decrease. The working memory capacity that the activation was compressing begins to become more available. The second element is the deliberate redescription of the situation. At the peak of conflict activation, the perception of the situation is most distorted, the threat is most amplified. The other party's position is most caricatured, the available options are most narrowed. The brief deliberate redescription asks what is actually happening here. Stripped of the emotional amplification, not what are they doing to me, what is happening between us? This question does not require the elimination of genuine grievance or the pretense that the difficulty is not real. It requires the distinction between the genuine features of the situation and the features added by the activated emotional state. Avoiding escalation is the strategic goal that emotional discipline in conflict makes achievable, the specific outcome of maintaining the regulated state, while the other party's activation is driving toward escalation. Escalation is the social process through which conflict intensifies beyond the level that either party initially intended or that the substance of the disagreement actually warrants. It follows a specific pattern. Party A offers an activated response. Party B, responding to the activation rather than to the substance, matches or exceeds it. Party A, now responding to the intensified activation, escalates further. The cycle continues, driven by the reciprocal contagion of activation rather than by the merits of the underlying disagreement, until it reaches a point of discharge through explosion, withdrawal, or the exhaustion of the activation. The calm person interrupts this cycle at the second step. When party A offers the activated response, the calm party B does not match the activation level. They respond to the substance rather than to the emotional temperature. This interruption does not guarantee that escalation will not occur. Party A may escalate regardless, but it denies the cycle, the reciprocal matching that drives the escalation pattern and gives the interaction the possibility of de-escalating toward the substance of the disagreement rather than continuing the escalation away from it. The person who interrupts the escalation cycle is not surrendering. They are exercising the specific form of social power available to the person who is not governed by the reciprocal activation norm, the power of redirecting the interaction toward substance and away from the emotional performance that escalation requires. This redirection frequently reads, to observers, as the more mature and more authoritative position in the conflict, even when the calm party's substantive position is not stronger than the escalating party's. Calm communication strategies are the specific verbal and tonal practices that implement the emotional discipline in the active communication of the conflict. The most foundational is the voice calibration, maintaining the vocal pace, volume, and tone that the deliberate mode produces rather than the vocal signatures of the activated state. The elevated pace, the increased volume, the reduced prosodic variation that signals the managed emotional state. The voice is the most direct external signal of the internal state, and its regulation both reflects the genuine internal regulation that the practices have built and reinforces it. The deliberate slowing of speech pace actually contributes to the physiological regulation that produced the need for the slowing. The second strategy is the content focus, maintaining the discussion on the substantive issues rather than being drawn into the relational framing that escalation produces. Conflict escalation almost always involves a shift from substance to relationship, from the specific disagreement to the broader question of who the other person is, what their behavior says about their character, how the conflict fits into the overall pattern of the relationship. This shift intensifies the emotional activation while reducing the possibility of resolution. The calm communicator maintains the substance focus not through rigid avoidance of the relational dimension, but through the consistent redirection of the discussion back to the specific, recoverable elements. The third strategy is the genuine question rather than the rhetorical one. The rhetorical question in conflict is a disguised assertion that claims the form of inquiry while actually making a point, typically in a way that is more aggressive than the direct assertion would be. The genuine question is actually seeking information. What specifically is the concern here? What would a resolution look like from your perspective? What do you need in order to move past this? Genuine questions interrupt the escalation pattern more effectively than most other single interventions, because they require the other party to shift from the emotional expression mode to the information provision mode, which tends to reduce the activation level and bring the cognitive quality of the exchange back toward the deliberate. Chapter 4. Reading manipulation. Manipulation rarely looks like manipulation. That is the first thing to understand about it. The word manipulation calls up images of the obviously calculating person, the transparently self-serving request, the flagrantly dishonest framing. These extreme forms exist and are recognizable enough to be defended against relatively easily. What is not so easily recognized, and what affects far more people far more of the time, is the ordinary, everyday manipulation that is embedded in normal social interaction, that uses entirely conventional social mechanisms, and that is often not consciously calculated by the person deploying it. The ordinary manipulation works through the normal social levers: the obligation created by past favors, the guilt produced by the expression of disappointment, the urgency generated by the implication of a deadline or cost of delay, the flattery that creates warmth and lowered defensiveness as preparation for a request, the social proof of others' agreement used to isolate your dissent. These mechanisms are not inherently manipulative. Each of them can be used in entirely legitimate ways. They become manipulative when they are used specifically to produce a behavioral output in you that serves the other person's purposes and that you would not produce if you were making the decision from accurate, undistorted information and genuine free choice. Subtle psychological tactics are the specific tools of ordinary manipulation, and naming them makes them more visible in the interactions where they appear. The obligation escalation is the systematic building of a favor debt that is then called upon at a moment and for a purpose that the favor recipient did not understand they were committing to. The favors arrive without explicit terms. The bill arrives later, larger than expected, and in a context where the social cost of refusal, the apparent ingratitude, is deployed as the primary pressure toward compliance. The manipulation is in the asymmetry: the initial favor appeared to be freely given, while the subsequent expectation is mandatory. The recipient consented to the favor but not to the terms under which it would eventually be called in. The guilt induction is the expression of disappointment, hurt, or suffering in a way that is calibrated specifically to produce guilt in the target and to use the guilt as the primary driver toward the desired behavior. The difference between genuinely expressing disappointment and inducing guilt as a manipulation tool is the degree to which the expression is calibrated to produce guilt rather than to communicate genuine feeling. The genuine expression is about the expressor's state. The guilt induction is about the target's resulting behavior. The urgency manufacture is the creation of time pressure where little or none genuinely exists. for the purpose of preventing the deliberate assessment that would allow the target to identify that the urgency is not genuine and the compliance it is producing is therefore not warranted. Urgency is effective as a manipulation tool because the psychological response to genuine urgency, the compression of deliberation. The foreclosure of the option range operates on manufactured urgency with the same force it applies to the real kind. The activation state produced does not distinguish between genuine and manufactured time pressure. Gaslighting and pressure are the forms of manipulation that specifically target the accuracy of the target's own perception and judgment, that seek not merely to produce a specific behavioral output, but to undermine the target's confidence in their own assessment of the situation. Gaslighting is the sustained contradiction of the target's accurate perception in a way that makes the target doubt their own perceptual reliability. It does not require deliberate evil intent. It can emerge from the systematic preference of one person's version of events over another's in situations where both versions are genuinely partial. But in its more systematic forms, it involves the explicit denial of events the target accurately remembers, the reframing of the target's reasonable responses as disproportionate or irrational, and the establishment of the gaslighter's version of reality as the authoritative one while the target's version is consistently delegitimized. The effect of sustained gaslighting is not primarily a single misunderstanding of a single event. It is the accumulation of many challenges to the target's perceptual authority, which over time produces a general reduction in the target's confidence in their own judgment, a condition that significantly increases their susceptibility to the gaslighter's framings of subsequent situations. Pressure manipulation is the sustained application of social or emotional pressure toward a specific behavioral compliance. In conditions where the target's social position makes resistance costly, the person who applies sustained pressure on a decision is not primarily making an argument for the outcome they want. They are applying a social force that is intended to make the cost of resisting compliance higher than the cost of providing it, regardless of whether the outcome they want is actually warranted by the merits. Recognizing hidden motives is the perceptual practice that makes all of these forms of manipulation more visible. The recognition asks, when a social situation produces a strong pull toward a specific behavior, who benefits from this behavior? And is that benefit disclosed in the social framing of the request or situation? When the benefit to the requester is transparent and the request is proportional to the relationship and the context, the situation is straightforward. When the framing of the request conceals or minimizes the benefit to the requester while emphasizing the benefit to the target or the moral obligation of the target, the concealment is the signal to look more carefully at the motives, not to assume bad faith, but to ensure that the compliance or non-compliance is based on accurate information rather than on the manipulated version of the situation the framing is providing. The person who can see what a social situation is actually designed to produce, not just what it presents itself as being about, is significantly less vulnerable to the ordinary manipulation that runs on the invisibility of its own design. This perceptual capacity does not require the adoption of a suspicious stance toward all social interaction. It requires the specific question, what behavior is being produced in me here? And does producing it serve my genuine purposes or someone else's? Chapter 5. Emotional distance. Sometimes the best protection you have is the refusal to take everything personally. The word protection in this context needs immediate clarification. Emotional distance is not the construction of a defensive wall, not the cultivation of indifference, and not the performance of being unaffected. It is the specific cognitive and emotional practice of receiving incoming social events from the observer position rather than from the fully immersed participant position, the ability to maintain enough perspective on what is happening to see it clearly, rather than being entirely inside the emotional experience of it. The fully immersed participant position is the default. When someone is dismissive of you, the default response is to experience the dismissal from inside a personal relationship with it. This is about me. This says something about my worth. This requires a response that addresses what it says about me. This personal relationship frame is often accurate. Some dismissals are genuinely personal. It is also often inaccurate, and the habitual application of it, regardless of whether it fits the specific situation, is a significant source of unnecessary reactivity. Psychological detachment is the deliberate practice of receiving incoming social events from a position that maintains enough observer perspective to assess them before personalizing them. The key word in that description is before. The emotional distance practice is not the permanent prevention of personalization. Some events deserve to be taken personally, and the refusal to take them personally would be the denial of a genuine relational reality. The practice is the temporary maintenance of the observer position long enough to assess whether this specific event, in this specific context, from this specific person, warrants the personal frame before the personal frame is applied. The assessment that the observer position enables is structured around a specific question: is this about me? Or is this about them? Most dismissive, provocative, or testing behavior is primarily about the person producing it, about their own state, their own needs, their own patterns, and only incidentally about the specific person receiving it. The person who is routinely dismissive is expressing a consistent pattern that they apply across most interactions, not a specific evaluation of you. The person who is testing and provoking is responding to their own social anxiety or control needs, not to something specific you have done that warrants the testing. Understanding this does not require the charitable assumption that everyone's behavior toward you is entirely disconnected from you as a person. It requires the accurate assessment, available from the observer position, of how much of what is happening is about you and how much is about the other person's own internal dynamics. The reactive person applies the personal frame automatically. The detached observer applies it deliberately, only when the assessment indicates it is warranted. Observing instead of reacting is the practical behavioral expression of the psychological detachment practice, and it requires the same basic skill as all the observer position practices described in this series: the partial withdrawal of attention from the fully immersed participant role to the observer role that can see the interaction from above it. The observer of a social interaction is attending to different things than the fully immersed participant. The participant is experiencing the content of the interaction, the words, the implications, the emotional charge. The observer is attending to the structure: what is actually happening here. As a social event, what is the other person's state? What is driving their behavior? What is the design of this interaction? What behavioral outputs is it generating in me? And are those outputs the ones that actually serve my purposes in this situation? This structural attention is available from the observer position and not from the participant position, because the participant position is occupied with the content experience. The shift between them is the cognitive act of the thinking gap applied to social interaction, the deliberate move from inside the experience to above it, long enough to see what is actually there. Emotional independence is the developed quality that results from the consistent practice of psychological detachment, the capacity to maintain a stable internal state that is not primarily determined by the social environment's current output. The emotionally dependent person's internal state closely tracks the social environment. Good approval produces good internal state. Disapproval produces bad internal state. Social warmth produces security. Social coolness produces anxiety. This close tracking is not pathological, it is the normal condition of a social organism in a social environment. But when the tracking is tight enough that the internal state is primarily determined by the social environment rather than by internal standards, the person has no stable ground from which to navigate the full range of social conditions they will encounter. Emotional independence does not mean indifference to approval or disconnection from the social environment. It means the maintenance of an internal state that has an anchor, a set of genuine values, standards, and self-assessments that is not primarily determined by the social environment's moment-to-moment evaluation. The person with this independence experiences the social environment fully but is not primarily constituted by it. The approval is welcome but not necessary. The disapproval is unwelcome but not destabilizing. This internal anchor is what the unshaken person has that makes them genuinely difficult to move. The social levers: approval, withdrawal, disapproval, application. The testing and the provocation work by targeting the dependency on social evaluation. When that dependency is reduced through the practice of emotional independence, the levers have less purchase. The provocation is received, assessed, and responded to from the stable ground of the internal anchor rather than from the wobbling ground of the fully socially dependent state. Chapter 6. Strategic silence. Silence used deliberately is often more powerful than any response you could offer. The social convention of prompt, reciprocal response, the norm that speaking creates an obligation to respond, that silence is awkward or rude, that a question demands an answer is one of the most reliably exploited conventions in social manipulation. It is exploited precisely because it is so deeply embedded in ordinary social expectation that departing from it feels, from inside the social context, like a violation of something important. The person who does not respond to a provocation feels the social pressure of the non-response as acutely as the person who responds creatively. The pressure is real. Its source is the social convention, and the social convention is the manipulation tool. Strategic silence is the deliberate use of the non-response, the willingness to let the social pressure of the convention exist without discharging it through the reactive reply that the convention specifies. This willingness is a form of social power that most people underestimate because the power is invisible. It operates through what does not happen rather than through what does, which makes it harder to see and harder to attribute to deliberate choice. Silence as a psychological tool operates through several distinct mechanisms that are worth understanding in detail. The first mechanism is the disruption of the expected pattern. Provocations and manipulative social inputs are designed for a specific response. The design anticipates the reactive reply, the defensive escalation, the compliance, the emotional expression. When the expected response does not arrive, the design fails. The provocative comment that receives silence rather than a reaction has not produced the demonstration of the target's triggered state that it was designed to produce. The manipulation that received no compliance has not achieved its goal. The silence has denied the design its completion. The second mechanism is the information asymmetry it creates. When you respond even carefully, even strategically, you are providing information about your position, your state, your priorities, your level of engagement with the issue at hand. When you are silent, you provide none of this. The other party must make inferences about your internal state from the absence of information, which is significantly more difficult than making them from the information your response would have provided. This asymmetry is useful in many social situations. It preserves your options, prevents premature commitment, and keeps the other party operating with incomplete information about where you stand. The third mechanism is the social pressure it creates on the other party. Silence following a statement or question creates a social vacuum that the person who created the silence is comfortable with, but the other party may not be. The discomfort of unacknowledged speech, of having said something and received nothing, tends to produce further speech from the person experiencing the discomfort. This further speech, produced in the slightly anxious condition of the unacknowledged statement, often contains more information, more transparency about the underlying motivation, or more revealing emotional expression than the original speech did. The silence invited the further disclosure. Letting others reveal themselves is one of the most specific and consistently useful benefits of strategic silence, the practice of creating attentional and social space in which the other person's genuine state, genuine motives, and genuine position become more visible through their own speech. Most people fill silence with speech, the silence after a provocation that did not receive its expected reaction is particularly uncomfortable for the provoker, because the expected pattern has failed and the provoker's own state, the need that drove the provocation, the anxiety that the non-creation is producing, has no social cover from the ongoing exchange. The silence invites the provoker to fill it, and what they fill it with is often revealing the cover explanation that shows they know the provocation was inappropriate. The escalation that shows the need behind it is more intense than the initial behavior suggested. The withdrawal that shows the provocation was dependent on the reaction for its social meaning. The person who can use silence to create the space in which others reveal themselves is gathering information about the interaction and the other party while contributing nothing that can be used against them. This is a genuine strategic advantage that requires only the tolerance of the social discomfort of the silence, which, like all the discomfort tolerances described in this series, is trainable through consistent practice. Avoiding unnecessary conflict is the practical consequence of strategic silence in many ordinary social situations. The recognition that many conflicts are produced by the reactive response to a provocation rather than by the substance of the underlying disagreement, and that the silence that prevents the reactive response prevents the conflict. Most interpersonal conflicts that escalate beyond the substance of the underlying disagreement do so through the reactive chain: the initial provocation, the reactive response, the escalating counter, the further escalation. Each link in this chain is a choice, in some cases a deliberate one, in most cases an automatic one. Strategic silence inserts a genuine choice at the second link. The reactive response that would initiate the escalation chain is not provided. The chain has no second link. This is not the avoidance of all conflict or the denial of all genuine disagreements. Some conflicts are worth having. Some disagreements need to be engaged directly rather than allowed to remain implicit through silence. The discipline of strategic silence is the development of the capacity to distinguish between the conflicts that are produced primarily by the reaction and that would not develop in the absence of the reaction, and the conflicts that are genuine disagreements about substantive issues that warrant direct engagement. The person who can make this distinction accurately, who neither reacts to every provocation nor retreats into silence when genuine engagement is required, has one of the most sophisticated and most practically valuable social capabilities available: the discrimination between when to speak and when to remain silent, made deliberately from genuine assessment rather than from the automatic output of the social convention, is a developed skill with a lifetime of practice available to deepen it. Chapter 7. Responding without losing control. A response is not the same as a reaction. A response is a choice. A reaction is what happens without one. This distinction sits at the center of the unshaken quality. The person who has been tested and has not been shaken is not the person who produced no behavioral output in response to the test. They are the person whose behavioral output was chosen rather than automatic, whose response reflected deliberate judgment about what to communicate and how to communicate it, rather than the direct expression of the activated emotional state the test was designed to produce. When response is required, when silence is not the right choice, when the situation genuinely calls for engagement rather than the non-response of strategic silence, the quality of the response is the expression of the internal composure that all the preceding chapters have been building. A response from a regulated state is qualitatively different from a reaction from an activated state, and the difference is apparent in every dimension of the communication: the verbal content, the tonal quality, the pacing, the choice of what to address and what to leave unaddressed. Calm responses are the verbal expression of the regulated state, and they have a specific set of characteristics that are worth developing as an explicit set of practices rather than leaving to emerge from the general quality of emotional regulation. The first characteristic is proportion. The calm response is calibrated to what the situation actually warrants rather than to what the activated state is driving toward. Not larger than the situation requires, not the counter-isolation that addresses a minor provocation as if it were a major attack. Not smaller than the situation requires, not the retreat from genuine engagement that conflict avoidance produces. Proportion to the actual substance, the actual relationship, and the actual purpose of the communication. Calibrating proportion requires the brief pause and the deliberate assessment of what this specific situation actually warrants. The assessment is calibrated by the question: what is the outcome I actually want from this interaction? And what response most serves that outcome? This question consistently produces a more proportionate response than the reactive default, which is calibrated to the emotional state rather than to the purpose. The second characteristic is specificity. The calm response addresses the specific, concrete substance of the situation rather than the emotional or relational frame. Not "you are always dismissive." This specific comment landed as dismissive, and here is why. Not "you never follow through." This specific commitment was not fulfilled, and here is the consequence. The specificity removes the rhetorical inflation that emotional activation typically adds to conflict communication and focuses the exchange on the elements that are actually resolvable. Strategic wording is the deliberate selection of language that produces the intended effect that communicates the necessary content clearly, accurately, and in a form that is receivable by the other party rather than triggering their defensive response. The most common wording mistakes in responses to testing and provocative behavior involve the language of character attribution, the response that addresses not the specific behavior but the character of the person who produced it. You are being manipulative. You always do this. You have no respect. These formulations are typically experienced by the recipient as attacks on their character rather than as feedback about their behavior, which activates the defensive response rather than the genuine engagement that would be more useful. The strategic alternative is the language of behavioral observation and impact statement. This specific behavior had this specific effect. The conversation went in this direction when you said this. My ability to trust this agreement is reduced when commitments are changed without discussion. These formulations address the behavior rather than the character, which keeps the defensive activation lower and the possibility of genuine engagement higher. Strategic wording also includes the deliberate choice of what not to address. Not every element of a testing or provocative exchange deserves a response. The minor jab, the low-stakes implication, the small boundary probe responding to each of these invests them with more significance than they warrant and creates a conversational pattern in which every small provocation receives full engagement, which is exhausting and serves the provoker's interest in the engagement more than it serves yours. The strategic communicator selects the elements that warrant response and allows the rest to pass without the investment of engagement. Controlling emotional tone is the third element of responding without losing control. The management of the vocal and physical qualities of the communication to reflect the regulated internal state rather than the activated one. Tone control is not the performance of calm. It is the expression of the genuine regulation that the practices of the preceding chapters have built. The voice that communicates genuine composure, the measured pace, the consistent volume, the absence of the vocal markers of agitation does so because it is the expression of an actual state rather than a managed performance. Performance is detectable and degrades under pressure. Genuine expression of a genuine state does not degrade, it deepens. The practical development of tone control under pressure is the same as the development of all the other capacities in this audiobook practice in the lower intensity situations. Building the habit gradually, moving to higher intensity applications as the capacity develops. The person who has practiced the voice calibration in minor difficult conversations has the habit available when the genuinely difficult exchange arrives. The person who has only ever encountered the technique intellectually has no practice to draw from when the pressure makes it hardest. Chapter 8. Maintaining dignity. When people try to shake you, they are testing your maturity. Dignity is the answer. Dignity, in the context of this audiobook, is a specific behavioral quality, not an abstract virtue or a social performance, but the concrete expression of a particular kind of self-governance. The person who maintains their dignity under social testing is the person who continues to behave in accordance with their own genuine standards regardless of what the testing behavior is attempting to produce. They are not elevated above the interaction. They are not performing superiority. They are simply not governed by it, not moved from their own behavioral standards by the attempt to move them. This quality of self-governance is what makes dignity so specifically effective as a response to testing and provocation. The test is designed to reveal the gap between the presented self and the actual behavioral patterns under pressure. Dignity is the absence of that gap, the consistency of behavior across conditions that reveals there is no different version to be provoked into. No hidden reactive pattern waiting to be activated by the right trigger. The test finds nothing useful because there is nothing there to find that is not already visible in the unactivated state. Self-respect under pressure is the internal experience that produces the external expression of dignity, the specific form of self-regard that does not require external validation and is therefore not destabilized by the withdrawal of it. The distinction between self-respect and ego-protection is foundational here, because much of what gets called self-respect in the context of testing and provocation is actually ego-protection, the defensive maintenance of a self-image that is contingent on external recognition and that becomes reactive when the recognition is threatened or withheld. Genuine self-respect does not depend on the testing person's acknowledgement of your worth. It is not contingent on the outcome of the social interaction. It is not something that needs to be defended against challenges because it is not primarily constituted by the absence of challenges. The person with genuine self-respect can receive a dismissive comment, a contemptuous gesture, an unfair criticism, without the internal state it produces being a fundamental challenge to their sense of their own value, because the sense of their own value is not primarily based on the opinions and behaviors of the people around them. Ego-protection, by contrast, is reactive by design. The ego that depends on external recognition for its stability is destabilized by the removal of that recognition, which means the withdrawal of recognition is a reliable lever for producing reactive behavior. The testing person who discovers that your ego-protection mechanism can be reliably activated by specific challenges to your competence, your standing, or your worth has discovered a lever that they can use whenever it serves their purposes. Emotional maturity is the quality that the dignity practice both expresses and develops, the specific kind of psychological development that produces consistent, self-governed behavior across the full range of social conditions rather than only in the comfortable ones. Emotional maturity, as the concept is used here, is not the product of age or experience alone. It is the product of the specific practices that this audiobook describes, the emotional regulation that interrupts the automatic reactive output, the self-awareness that distinguishes genuine self-respect from ego-protection, the independence that maintains behavioral standards without requiring the external validation that most people's behavioral standards depend on. These are developed capacities, not natural endowments, and they are available for deliberate development regardless of where the starting point is. The behaviorally mature person in a testing situation displays several specific qualities. The first is the maintenance of ordinary behavioral standards when the testing is designed to provoke their abandonment. The person who continues to treat the provoker with basic respect, regardless of the disrespect being offered, is demonstrating that their behavioral standards are not contingent on reciprocity. This unconditional quality is both unusual and powerful. It is not what the test expected to find, and it denies the tester the information about the reactive pattern that the test was seeking. The second quality is the absence of the need to win the interaction. The ego-defensive response to testing is organized around the goal of winning, of demonstrating that the test failed, of showing that the implied diminishment was wrong, of establishing superiority in the exchange. This goal produces the specific reactive behaviors that the testing was designed to produce, because it accepts the frame that the interaction is a contest and engages on those terms. The mature response does not engage on those terms. It is not organized around winning, which means it is not available to be drawn into the contest. Choosing dignity over ego is the specific dational practice that emotional maturity is built through in testing situations, the consistent choice when the reaction that ego-provocation is driving toward and the response that genuine dignity would produce or different, of the latter over the former. This choice is not always easy, and it is not always made cleanly. The ego-protective impulse is strong, and the social context of testing often makes the reactive response feel not just natural but morally necessary, as if the calm, dignified non-aggression would be the moral concession of ground that should be held. The experience of this moral pressure is the testing. Recognizing the pressure as the test, rather than as a genuine moral obligation to defend against the implication, is the cognitive key to making the choice that dignity requires. Each time the choice is made, each time dignity is chosen over the ego-protective reactive response, the practice deepens. The neural infrastructure of the dignified response is strengthened. The pull of the ego-protective reaction is slightly reduced, and the accumulated evidence of many dignified responses builds the self-knowledge and the self-trust that genuine self-respect is founded on. Chapter 9. Calm confidence. True confidence is quiet. It does not need to announce itself. Chapter 6 of the previous audiobook in this series developed the distinction between performed and genuine confidence in detail. This chapter returns to that distinction in the specific context of the unshaken quality, the particular form that genuine confidence takes in the person who has built the composure that social testing cannot find purchase on. The performed confidence that many people bring to social environments is actually vulnerability in disguise. Not always. Some performances are genuinely grounded in real capacity and serve primarily as the communication of that capacity rather than as a substitute for it. But the performed confidence that is compensation for genuine uncertainty is specifically vulnerable to the testing behaviors described in this audiobook, because the testing is designed to find and exploit exactly the gap between performance and genuine capacity. The performer cannot afford to be tested because the test may reveal the gap. Their social behavior is therefore organized partly around the management of situations to prevent the test from occurring in conditions where it might produce revealing results. This management consumes energy, creates brittleness, the specific fragility of the defended position, and produces the kind of coversion to challenges that reveals the underlying anxiety far more clearly than any test could. Genuine calm confidence is different in its structure and in its social expression. It does not need to announce itself because it does not need the announcement. The person with genuine confidence in what they have, in the actual capacities they have developed, the actual standards they maintain, the actual record of functioning under conditions that tested the functioning, has no particular need to communicate that confidence explicitly. It communicates through the behavior itself, through the consistency of the behavior across conditions, through the absence of the defensive and ego-protective reactions that the testing is designed to produce. through the quality of presence that comes from knowing what you are rather than managing how you appear. Inner stability is the foundational quality that genuine calm confidence expresses, the settled, consistent internal state that is not primarily determined by the social environment's current evaluation of you. The inner stability described here is not the stability of the person who has never been challenged. It is the stability of the person who has been challenged repeatedly, who has engaged with the challenges from the practices that this audiobook describes, and who has accumulated through those engagements the specific self-knowledge that makes genuine stability possible. The stability is grounded in evidence in the actual record of having functioned under conditions that required genuine composure, of having maintained dignity when the testing was attempting to undermine it, of having chosen the deliberate response when the reactive one was easier and more socially expected. This evidence-based stability is qualitatively different from the aspired-to stability that has no behavioral foundation. You can aspire to be calm under pressure without having ever been calm under pressure. And the aspiration is real, but the stability it produces is fragile. It holds in comfortable conditions and fails when the pressure becomes genuine. The evidence-based stability holds under genuine pressure because it is not an aspiration but a capacity that has been built and tested. Non-greetive presence is the specific social expression of the inner stability, the quality of being fully present in a social environment without being governed by the reactions the environment is producing in the activated participants. The non-greetive person is not detached from the social environment. They are fully in it, registered, engaged, attentive. What is different is the relationship between being in the environment and being moved by it. The fully reactive person is moved by everything. Every temperature shift in the social environment produces a corresponding shift in their internal state and their behavioral output. The non-greetive person is moved by the substance, by the genuine relational developments, the genuine changes in the information available, the genuine shifts in what the situation requires, but not by the social performances, the testing behavior, the provocations, the manipulation attempts that are not actually about substance but about establishing positions in the social hierarchy or extracting behavioral compliance. The distinction between substance and performance is the key that the non-greetive practice requires. The person who cannot make this distinction has two poor options: react to everything, which makes them highly available to social manipulation, or detach from everything, which makes them unavailable to genuine engagement. The person who can distinguish substance from performance has the third option: full engagement with the substance and genuine composure in the face of the performance. This is the option that genuine non-greetive presence provides. Quiet psychological strength is the cumulative quality that the inner stability and non-greetive presence produce, the specific form of strength that does not announce itself, does not need to defend itself, and does not diminish when the performance stops because it was never primarily a performance. Quiet psychological strength is visible in the negative space. You see it not in what the person does, but in what they do not do. They do not escalate, do not become defensive, do not need to win, do not provide the reactive output that the testing was designed to produce. This absence of the expected output is the clearest possible signal of the internal capacity that produced it. The person who remains consistently calm when social pressure is specifically designed to produce an activated response is not lucky or naturally temperamental. They have built something that is maintaining the regulation. The building of that something is precisely what this audiobook has been doing, chapter by chapter, and what the next and final chapter completes. Chapter 10. Becoming impossible to shake. When people discover that you cannot be moved, they stop trying to move you. This is the specific social outcome of the unshaken quality, the practical consequence of having built the genuine composure that the preceding 9 chapters describe, not a permanent exemption from being tested. People test continuously, often automatically, and the testing does not simply cease because you have become more difficult to move. But the specific quality of the testing changes, and the pattern of what happens after multiple failed tests changes significantly, in ways that reduce the frequency and the intensity of the testing over time. The mechanism is straightforward. Testing behavior, even when it is automatic rather than deliberate, is reinforced by results. The test that produces a useful result, the reaction that reveals the lever. The provocation that produces the triggered response is reinforced and tends to be repeated. The test that produces no useful result, the provocation that receives no reaction. The challenge that finds no anxious defensiveness, the manipulation attempt that is received and assessed rather than automatically executed is not reinforced. The testing pattern of the specific person toward you tends to shift in the direction of the patterns that are producing results and away from the ones that are not. Emotional resilience is the first component of the impossible to shake quality, the specific capacity to receive sustained pressure without the pressure progressively degrading the regulatory system that is managing it. Resilience is often confused with hardness, the refusal to be affected, the capacity to absorb without feeling. This is not what resilience is. Resilience is the capacity to be fully affected, to feel the impact of what happens, and to continue functioning with good quality from a stable internal foundation despite the impact. The resilient person is not hard. They bend fully. What they have that the non-resilient person does not is the capacity to return to the stable state after bending, rather than remaining distorted by the impact or breaking under it. The development of resilience through the practices of this audiobook is the development of exactly this return capacity, the ability to be fully affected by a difficult social event, to feel the impact of the provocation, the manipulation, the testing, and to reorient to the stable internal foundation quickly enough that the quality of the subsequent response is not significantly degraded by the impact. Not immediately. The return takes time, and the time it takes shortens with practice, but consistently enough that the sustained social pressure that the impossible to shake quality is built for does not produce the cumulative degradation that wears down the regulatory capacity. Mental composure is the sustained expression of the regulated state across the full duration of social testing and pressure, the maintenance of the deliberate thinking, choosing mode rather than the reactive mode, regardless of how long the pressure continues. This sustained maintenance is the specific challenge that distinguishes genuine mental composure from the occasional disciplined response. Most people can produce a single calm response in a difficult interaction. The composure that this audiobook builds is the ability to produce many calm responses across the duration of a sustained testing interaction, to maintain the regulated state not just in the first test, but in the 5th, the 10th, the 20th, when the social pressure has been sustained and the regulatory resources have been continuously taxed. The sustainability of mental composure under sustained pressure is built through the same progressive training logic that all the previous chapters have described, beginning in the lower intensity situations. Building the capacity through accumulated practice, gradually extending the duration and intensity of the application as the capacity develops. The person who has maintained composure across 10 minutes of a difficult conversation has a more extensive regulatory resource than the person who has only ever maintained it for 30 seconds. The person who has maintained it across many such conversations has a more extensive resource than the person who has only done it once. The resource is real and it is developed through use. Every instance of sustained composure under pressure is both an expression of the built capacity and an increment of its further development. The capacity and the practice are not separable. The capacity is built through the practice, and the practice is the ongoing development of the capacity. Psychological authority is the specific form of social influence that the impossible-to-shake quality produces, the authority that comes not from formal designation or from the assertion of superiority, but from the consistent demonstration of the specific qualities that social environments create demand for in difficult circumstances. In any social environment that contains testing, provocation, conflict, or manipulation, the people in that environment are continuously elaborating their understanding of who can be trusted to remain stable under pressure, whose behavior can be predicted to hold to consistent standards across conditions, and who is governing their behavior from genuine internal standards rather than from the reactive output of whatever the current social stimulus is producing. These elaborations are not explicit or fully conscious. They are the automatic social intelligence assessment that every person is conducting of every other person in their social environment. The person who consistently demonstrates composure under testing, who is reliably unmoved by the provocations that move most people, who consistently responds from deliberate assessment rather than from reactive pattern, whose behavior is consistent across the comfortable and the uncomfortable conditions, earns a specific quality of trust and respect in the social calibration that most people cannot manufacture through any amount of self-presentation or status performance. It is earned through the one mechanism that is proof against performance, the sustained demonstration of the genuine article under the conditions that most reliably distinguish it from the performed version. The impossible-to-shake person has not made themselves immune to challenge. They have made themselves genuinely adequate to it. Not through armor or distance or the performance of invulnerability, through the development of the actual internal architecture that functions as well under pressure as it does in comfortable conditions. This is the psychological authority that no test can undermine, because no test can find the gap between the appearance and the reality that manipulation requires to function. There is no gap. The appearance and the reality are the same thing. That is what has been built. Closing. The architecture of the Unshaken. 10 chapters, 1 integrated architecture. The architecture is not a collection of tactical responses to testing and provocation. It is a fundamentally different relationship to the social environment, a relationship in which you are genuinely less available to being moved by what people do to try to move you, not because you have become cold or disengaged or armored against genuine connection, but because the practices that constitute each layer of this audiobook have produced a genuine change in what governs your behavior in social environments. Chapter 1 established the social reality that the architecture is built for testing is continuous, largely automatic, and organized around the assessment of where the levers are. Reactions reveal the leverage map. The unshaken person provides a much less legible map not by hiding who they are, but by governing their behavioral expression through deliberate choice rather than through the automatic output of triggered patterns. The test finds what the deliberate mind has chosen to communicate rather than what the reactive system automatically produced. Chapter 2 developed the psychology of provocation and its specific mechanism. The provocation requires the reaction to complete its circuit. Without the reaction, the provocation fails. Understanding this inverts the felt obligation to respond the response that feels necessary. That the social script appears to demand is precisely what the provocation was designed to produce. Recognizing the game while it is being played is the cognitive prerequisite for not playing by its rules. Chapter 3 built the emotional discipline for the most demanding environment: active conflict, the escalation cycle, and how the calm response interrupts it at the second link. The physiological regulation that keeps the deliberate mind accessible when the activation is highest. The communication strategies: voice calibration, content focus, genuine questions that redirect conflict toward resolution rather than performance. And the foundational insight: the strongest person in any conflict is the one who is still thinking. Chapter 4 mapped the manipulation architecture in the ordinary social environment: the subtle tactics of obligation escalation, guilt induction, and urgency manufacture, the more severe forms of sustained perception undermining and social pressure, and the perceptual practice that makes all of them more visible: the question that asks what behavior is being produced and whose purposes it serves. The person who can see the design of the manipulation is significantly less available to being governed by it. Chapter 5 built the emotional distance practice not as detachment or coldness, but as the maintenance of the observer position long enough to assess whether the personal frame is warranted before applying it. Psychological detachment as the temporary maintenance of perspective. The distinction between the thing being about you and the thing being primarily about the other person's own state and patterns. And emotional independence as the developed quality that results from consistent practice, the internal anchor that makes the social environment's evaluation welcome but not necessary. Chapter 6 developed strategic silence, the specific, powerful form of non-response that disrupts the expected pattern, creates information asymmetry, and invites the other party to reveal more than they intended through the discomfort of the unacknowledged speech. Silence is a psychological tool. The practice of letting others reveal themselves, and the developed discrimination between the conflicts worth engaging and the ones that exist only because of the reaction they require. Chapter 7 built the practice of responding without losing control, the quality of the chosen response when silence is not the right choice and genuine engagement is required. The calm response calibrated to proportion and specificity. Strategic wording that addresses behavior rather than character. And tone control as the expression of genuine regulation rather than the performance of composed delivery. Chapter 8 developed the dignity practice, the specific form of self-governance that is the external expression of genuine self-respect. The distinction between self-respect and egopretation, and the specific vulnerability that egopretation creates. Emotional maturity as the quality that produces consistent behavior across conditions. and the discipline of choosing dignity over the ego-protective reactive response in the many ordinary moments when that choice is available. Chapter 9 named the quality that all of this accumulates into calm confidence, the genuine, experience grounded, internally entered confidence that is quiet because it does not need to announce itself. Inner stability as evidence-based rather than aspiration-based. Non-reactive presence as full engagement without being governed by the social environment's performances. And quiet psychological strength as the quality visible in the negative space in what the person does not do when the testing attempts to produce it. And Chapter 10 named the destination the impossible to shake quality, the social outcome of having built what the 9 preceding chapters describe. Emotional resilience as the return capacity, not the refusal to bend. Mental composure as the sustained regulation across the duration of pressure, not only the single disciplined response, and psychological authority as the specific form of social influence earned through the one mechanism that is proof against performance, the consistent demonstration of the genuine article under the conditions that most reliably expose the performed version. The person you are becoming through this practice is not a harder or colder version of who you are. They are a more deliberate one. A version who meets the testing with genuine composure rather than reactive pattern. Who receives the manipulation with clear perception rather than automatic execution. Who maintains dignity under pressure not as a performance of superiority, but as the natural expression of behavioral standards that hold across conditions. The person who cannot be shaken is the person who has genuinely built the architecture that testing finds nothing to work with. The test arrives. You notice it. You assess it. You choose your response. You remain yourself. That is the whole practice. Applied consistently. Across every test that follows. Unshaken.